In the frostbitten silence of Fort St. James, British Columbia, a remote outpost 950 kilometers north of Vancouver, where dreams often froze before they could take root, Brian Roy Spencer was born. This was no cradle of glory. It was a harsh, unforgiving wilderness where winters clawed through the cracks of modest homes, turning breath to ice in your lungs. Yet, in this desolate corner of the world, on rough, makeshift rinks carved out by his father's hands, a relentless force began to stir. They called him Spinner, not for grace or flair, but for the chaotic, unstoppable storm he became, fast, fierce, and impossible to ignore. Brian's early life was shaped by the brutal elements and a family that knew survival demanded fight. His father, Roy Spencer, was a hard man, an Army veteran, a machinist, a drinker, and a dreamer whose ambitions burned not for himself, but for his son. In the Spencer household, hockey wasn't just a game, it was salvation, the only escape hatch from the suffocating cold and isolation of Fort St. James. Roy's belief in Brian was ferocious, a blind faith that could either forge legends or shatter them. He built rinks in their backyard, flooding them with water that froze under starlit skies, and taught Brian to skate with a purpose, to fight for every inch, every chance, every dream. Brian wasn't born with natural finesse. He didn't glide like Bobby Orr or shoot like Maurice Richard. What he had was raw, unpolished intensity, a grit honed by long winters, by hauling gravel alongside his father, by learning to dodge fists both on the ice and in the rough-and-tumble world beyond it. Fort St. James gave nothing freely. Every scrap of progress was earned through blood and sweat. And Brian learned early that to be seen, to be somebody, you had to fight harder than anyone else. They nicknamed him Spinner in the junior leagues, where he tore through teams like a wrecking ball. Calgary, Regina, Estevan, Swift Current. He wasn't chasing elegance, he was chasing impact. Goals and penalty minutes piled up with equal fervor. Brian didn't care about winning beauty contests. He hit hard, bled willingly, and made sure scouts couldn't look away. His style was unapologetic, a blend of hustle, heart, and havoc. In 1969, the Toronto Maple Leafs took notice, drafting him 55th overall. Spinner clawed his way into the NHL the only way he knew how, without permission, without apology, and with a chip on his shoulder the size of British Columbia. His arrival in the big leagues should have been a triumph, a moment to cement his place in the hockey world. December 12th, 1970, was supposed to be that night. His first game broadcast on Hockey Night in Canada, a planned intermission interview, a chance to shine under the national spotlight. Back in Fort St. James, Roy Spencer rallied the town. He hooked up a new antenna, invited neighbors, and boasted, "My boy's on TV tonight." It was the culmination of years of sacrifice, of frozen rinks and relentless drills. Brian was no longer just a kid from the wilderness. He was Roy's dream made flesh. But the dream turned to ash. CBC, in a last-minute decision, chose to air the Vancouver Canucks game instead. Roy, already a man of sharp edges and simmering resentments, snapped. The betrayal, decades of disappointment, of a world that never gave him or his son a fair shake, boiled over. He grabbed a handgun, got in his car, and drove 2 hours through a snowstorm to a TV station in Prince George. There, fueled by fury and desperation, he stormed inside, took hostages, and demanded they air the Toronto game or stop broadcasting hockey altogether. When police arrived, a tense standoff ensued. Roy shot a constable in the foot. And when he stepped outside, the RCMP opened fire. Roy Spencer died on the pavement, his final act a tragic, misguided attempt to fight for his son's moment. Brian didn't learn of his father's death until after the game. The weight of it, his father's sacrifice, his rage, his loss, could have crushed him. Yet, the very next night in Buffalo, Spinner laced up his skates and played. Not just played, dominated. He recorded 3 assists in one of the best performances of his career. Coach John McClellan called it one of the gamest performances I've ever seen. Brian didn't cry. He didn't collapse. He did what Roy had always demanded. He played hockey. But beneath the surface, something fractured. A wound opened that no stat sheet could measure, one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. Brian's NHL career spanned 10 seasons, 4 teams, and 553 regular season games. He played for the Toronto Maple Leafs, New York Islanders, Buffalo Sabres, and Pittsburgh Penguins, amassing 80 goals, 143 assists, and countless bruises. He was never a superstar, never a name etched on the Stanley Cup, but he was something else, a grinder, an enforcer, the guy you sent out when the game got ugly. Spinner chased pucks into corners and threw fists without hesitation. He made opponents feel every inch of the rink, every second of his presence. When Brian Spinner Spencer arrived in Buffalo to play for the Sabres, he found something he'd been searching for his entire life, a place that felt like home. The fans at Memorial Auditorium didn't care that he wasn't a finesse player like Gilbert Perreault or a goal-scoring machine like Rick Martin. They saw in Spinner a reflection of their own blue-collar ethos, hard-working, unrelenting, and fiercely loyal. He wasn't there to dazzle with flashy dekes or highlight reel goals. He was there to grind, to sweat, to throw his body into the fray. And for that, the Buffalo faithful embraced him as one of their own. Every time Spinner stepped onto the ice, the energy and the awe shifted. His role was clear: disrupt, agitate, protect. He chased loose pucks into corners, delivered bone-rattling hits, and dropped the gloves when the game demanded it. The crowd fed off his intensity, erupting into chants of "Spinner, Spinner," whenever he slammed an opponent into the boards or stood up to an enforcer twice his size. To them, he was more than a player. He was a working-class warrior, a symbol of the grit and heart that defined Buffalo's identity in the 1970s. The 1974-75 season was Spinner's pinnacle. Playing alongside linemates like Danny Gare and Don Luce, he found a rhythm that showcased his tenacity and underrated skill. He tallied a career-high 41 points, 12 goals and 29 assists in 76 games, a testament to his ability to contribute beyond the fisticuffs. His relentless forechecking and willingness to battle in the trenches created space for his teammates, helping propel the Sabres to their first-ever Stanley Cup final against the Philadelphia Flyers. Though the Sabres fell short, losing in 6 games to the Broad Street Bullies, Spinner's impact was undeniable. He wasn't the star of the show. Perreault's artistry and Martin's sniping took that spotlight, but he was the heartbeat, the pulse that kept the team fighting. Off the ice, Spinner was a fan favorite in a city that cherished authenticity. He'd linger after games, signing autographs for kids bundled in Sabres jerseys, sharing a quick word with fans who saw in him their own struggles and resilience. In Buffalo's bars and diners, stories of his on-ice heroics, laying out a Montreal enforcer or stealing a puck to set up a goal, became local legend. To the fans, Spinner embodied old-school hockey, tough as nails, loyal to a fault, and unyielding in the face of adversity. He gave everything and asked for nothing, a quality that endeared him to a city that prided itself on hard work and perseverance. Yet, even as the cheers reverberated through the Aud, darker currents swirled beneath the surface. The pain of his father's death in 1970, a surreal tragedy that saw Roy Spencer gunned down outside a Prince George TV station after demanding airtime for his son's NHL debut, never left him. Roy had been more than a father. He was Brian's compass, his taskmaster, his dreamer. His ferocious belief in Brian's potential had driven Spinner to the NHL, but it also left a crushing weight. The expectation to live up to a dream that wasn't entirely his own. Every hit he threw, every shift he skated, carried the ghost of Roy's sacrifice. The physical toll of his role as an enforcer compounded the emotional strain. Night after night, Spinner absorbed punishment, punches to the jaw, elbows to the ribs, collisions that rattled his bones. Concussions, though not yet fully understood in the 1970s, were a constant risk for a player who never shied away from contact. His body, once a weapon, began to betray him with nagging injuries: a battered shoulder, a knee that swelled after every game, hands scarred from countless fights. The adrenaline of the rink masked the pain, but in the quiet moments, alone in a hotel room or nursing a beer after practice, it festered. Spinner's intensity, his greatest asset, was also his vulnerability. The fire that made him a fan favorite burned too hot, spilling into late-night bar fights and impulsive decisions. Teammates admired his heart, but worried about his recklessness. Coaches valued his hustle, but saw the toll it took. And in Buffalo, where he was loved, the shadows grew longer, unnoticed by the fans who chanted his name, but ever present in the man who carried them. By 1979, the NHL was changing. The game was getting faster, flashier, favoring skill over brawn. The era of the pure enforcer was waning, and players like Spinner, grinders who lived for the dirty work, were being left behind. His body, battered by a decade of relentless play, couldn't keep up. A rotator cuff injury sapped his strength. Chronic knee pain slowed his stride. The Sabres, building around young stars and new strategies, let him go. After brief stints with the Pittsburgh Penguins, Spinner's NHL career was over. He was 30 years old, with 553 games, 80 goals, 143 assists, and a lifetime of bruises to his name. The transition was brutal. The roar of the crowd, the camaraderie of the locker room, the structure of the game, all of it vanished overnight. Brian was no longer Spinner, the Sabres' heartbeat. He was just Brian, a man standing in the silence he'd spent his life trying to outrun. The rink had been his refuge, a place where he could channel his pain and prove his worth. Without it, he was unmoored, adrift in a world that didn't know what to do with a broken warrior. Hoping for a fresh start, Brian moved to Florida, far from the frozen rinks of his youth. He took on odd jobs, working as a mechanic, driving trucks, anything to pay the bills. He tried to build a life away from hockey, to find purpose in the mundane. But the ghosts of his past followed him south. His father's death, the unfulfilled dreams Roy had pinned on him, the physical and emotional scars of a brutal career, they clung to him like damp heat. The ache in his joints was a constant reminder of what he'd lost. The silence, once drowned out by the crowd, was deafening. Addiction crept in, insidious and relentless. It started with alcohol, beers after work, then whiskey to numb the pain. Drugs followed, a quick hit to escape the memories. Cocaine, then crack, offered a fleeting rush that made the world feel alive again. But the high always faded, leaving him chasing the next fix. He fell in with fast friends, dealers, drifters, opportunists who saw a former NHLer with money to burn. When the savings ran dry, so did they. The man who once commanded the ice at Memorial Auditorium was now living in a ramshackle hut in the Florida swamps, surrounded by the dregs of society, a shadow of the storm he'd once been. His days became a blur of desperation. He'd pawn hockey memorabilia, jerseys, sticks, anything tied to his Sabres years, for a few bucks to score drugs. The pride he'd once felt in his NHL career was buried under shame and survival. He was no longer the kid from Fort Saint, James, who'd fought his way to the top. He was a man unraveling, consumed by the very fire that had once defined him. In 1987, Brian's descent hit rock bottom. He was arrested in Florida, charged with kidnapping and murder in a drug-related incident. The headlines were merciless. Former NHL enforcer turned killer. The media, hungry for a sensational story, painted him as a villain, a fallen athlete who'd traded glory for crime. To the public, it was a tidy narrative, hockey tough guy gone bad. But the truth was messier, as it always was with Spinner. The case was flimsy from the start. The key witness, a fellow addict, was unreliable, their story riddled with inconsistencies. The evidence was circumstantial, thin as the humid Florida air. In court, Brian's past came to his defense. His former Sabres teammate Rick Martin, a star from the 1970s, flew in to testify, speaking to the man he'd known, loyal, hard-working, a teammate who'd give anything for the game. Martin's words and the lack of concrete evidence swayed the jury. After just 1 hour of deliberation, they acquitted Brian. The courtroom exhaled. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like Spinner might get his redemption arc. He emerged from the trial, vowing to change. He spoke of getting clean, of rebuilding his life, of honoring the second chance he'd been given. Friends and former teammates rallied around him, hoping the old Spinner, the one who'd played through unimaginable loss, could resurface. But addiction is a storm that doesn't relent, and Brian's was far from over. 3 months later, on June 3, 1988, Brian was back in Riviera Beach, Florida, a place where desperation hung as heavy as the heat. He'd bought crack cocaine with a man named Gregory Scott Cook, a transient figure in his spiraling world. According to Cook's account, a car pulled up as they stood on a street corner. A man inside demanded money, likely over a drug debt. Words were exchanged. Then gunfire erupted. A bullet tore through Brian's arm, ripped into his chest, pierced his heart, and shredded his lung. He collapsed on the sidewalk, blood pooling beneath him. By the time paramedics rushed him to St. Mary's Hospital, it was too late. Brian Spencer was dead at 38. The irony was unbearable. The man who'd survived countless brawls on the ice, who'd taken punches from the NHL's toughest enforcers, who'd played a career-best game the night after his father's violent death, was felled by a single bullet in a senseless street dispute. Over a handful of drugs, a life that had burned so brightly was extinguished. It was cruel, absurd, and yet, in the tragic arc of Brian's story, it felt almost inevitable. The storm that had defined him, his intensity, his pain, his refusal to quit, had consumed him at last. Brian's death wasn't the end of his story. His life, with all its triumphs and tragedies, was captured in Gross Misconduct by Martin O'Malley, a book that peeled back the layers of Spinner's journey with unflinching honesty. Published in 1988, it explored the forces that shaped him, his father's obsessive dreams, the brutality of his NHL role, the addiction that claimed him. In 1993, the book was adapted into a TV movie directed by Adam Egoyan and starring Paul Gross as Brian. The film was a gut punch, lauded by critics as haunting and heartbreaking. It portrayed a man forever skating uphill, chasing a dream that slipped further away with every stride, a life defined by heart and haunted by loss. Brian left behind a fractured legacy, 5 children who carried his name but little of his story, 2 ex-wives who'd loved him through his brightest and darkest days, and a twin brother, Byron, who'd never shared his passion for hockey or the weight of Roy's expectations. Spinner had once dreamed of acting, of telling stories on the big screen, perhaps seeing himself as a rugged hero in a Hollywood tale. In a cruel twist, he became a story himself, a cautionary tale frozen in film, playing on screens he'd never lived to see.